convicted sex offender has been found guilty of raping and murdering a Polish student in Glasgow.
Peter Tobin has been charged with the murder of Vicky Hamilton.
She was killed in the church and her body was concealed under the floor. This victim was called Angelika Kluk, and the person that was ultimately charged for that was Peter Tobin.
This is Detective David Swindle. In 2006, he was called to a case where a young Polish woman was found dead in a Glasgow church.
When I became involved in that at the very start, and I saw the ferocity of what had happened to Angelika Kluk, the way he had killed her, the way he had concealed the body under the church floor, the way he had stayed at the scene for some time, I thought, there's more to this. And it would have been very easy for me just to accept the fact that we were working in the Peter Tobin case and he was going to life imprisonment. But my initial thoughts on that when I saw this was, this individual has done this before.
Detective Swindle's hunch was right, because the suspect Peter Tobin had killed others. He found this out by setting up a separate and confidential investigation looking into Peter Tobin's life.
I had that intuition in my mind that Peter Tobin didn't reach the age of 60 and hadn't committed a crime before. So in my mind I thought, he has done this before, and I set about to test that hypothesis, that theory in my mind.
This is The Y Factor on the BBC World Service. I'm Nastaran Tavakoli-Far, and this is the first in a two-parter on intuition. We talk about the power of our intuitions. You know, those senses we have telling us to do something or to avoid someone. So I want to know why or whether we should even trust our intuition. This week we're going to start on the optimistic side and dig into why we should trust intuition. We'll come back to Detective Swindle a little later, but first let's get back to basics and figure out exactly what we're talking about. What is intuition? We often refer to a gut feeling or a hunch or those spidey senses. You know, that feeling you have when you just know what to do and you might not even be able to explain why. Now, I'm personally a big fan of using my intuition. As I've got older, I've come to trust it more, and I feel less bad about that too. The problem is, it can sound like some sort of weird woo thing. Just the word itself makes me think of psychics and tents waving crystals and whatnot. But if I found using it so helpful in my own life, then surely there's something more substantial going on. I spoke to psychologist Gary Klein and Nobel Prize-winning economist Daniel Kahneman, who are two big hitters in the world of intuition, as well as being good friends with each other. Let's start with Gary Klein.
There's no clear definition, so people pick a definition that suits them. For me, intuition is the way we convert our previous experiences into action. And we draw on our unconscious, and that makes people uncomfortable because it's unconscious. It sounds spooky. It sounds like it's ESP, but it's not.
ESP stands for extrasensory perception, or a sixth sense. So this all sounds a bit mysterious, but he says intuition isn't that weird or random.
For me, intuition is the set of patterns we've learned, the set of prototypes that we've learned over time and through experience. And we retrieve them and make matches, and we do it without being aware of what are the criteria, what are the steps, because there aren't any steps. So how does it work? We do this recognition. We make this recognition based on patterns and prototypes we've learned, and that lets us size up situations.
If a situation matches patterns we've picked up, then we're prepared for what to do next. However, if a situation deviates from these patterns, then that's a warning that we should slow down and think about what to do next. Professor Klein says that our decision-making tends to be based on a blend of intuition and deliberate analysis. So now we know what intuition is. When can we trust it? Professor Kahneman told me of work he did with Gary Klein looking into this very question.
I've studied intuition in many ways. I've studied intuition, incorrect intuitions, for a lot of my life, my professional life. And I spent several years working with Gary Klein, who is my friend and has became my friend through working together, although we agree on absolutely nothing.
So when can we trust our intuition?
Actually, it turned out to have a pretty simple answer. The first place, you cannot have intuitions unless the world is sufficiently regular for there to be rules that you unconsciously learn to apply. So when the system is chaotic or completely unpredictable, like the stock market, say, people think they have intuitions, but actually they don't. They don't have intuition that are skillful or that you can trust. So the first condition for intuition that you can trust is a regular world. And there are some professionals who do live in a regular world and some who don't. So anesthesiologists live in a pretty regular world, so they learn the regularities. Chess players live in a perfectly regular world, and so they can develop intuitions. And indeed, chess players are the main model of successful intuitions. When you live in a regular world, you have an opportunity to develop intuition. But then it takes a lot of time to do that. You have to learn the regularities. To develop skilled, expert intuition takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of repetition. And there is one extra condition. You have to get feedback from the world when you make judgments, intuitive judgments, whether they are accurate or not. And that feedback had better be rapid, otherwise you will not learn anything.
Gary Klein has done a lot of studies looking at firefighters. He told me of one firefighter who had a really dicey situation and was convinced it was extrasensory perception, that sixth sense, which got him out of it.
So it was early in his career. It's a single-family house. He sees smoke coming out of the back. He tells his crew, okay, we're going to go in. I think they took in an 1 3/4 line. And he figures back of the house is probably a kitchen fire. So they go in through the front door towards the back. There's the kitchen. He sees smoke coming out. He says, okay, we're going to hit the fire with a blast of water. They do that. Then they turn the water off to see the effect. No effect. The smoke comes back at them. That's strange. He said, let's hit it again. They hit it again and turn the water off. No effect. The smoke is still there. So they retreat out of the kitchen back into the front room to try to figure out what's going to happen next. And his intuition said, get out of here. And he told his crew, everybody leave this house immediately. And they all went running out, diving through windows, out the door. And right after they all left the house, the floor where they had been standing collapsed. And it collapsed into the fire. The fire was right beneath them in the basement. And he didn't even know there was a basement.
Klein dug in more to figure out what led this firefighter to make the life-saving call to get his team out of the house ASAP, despite not really knowing the full details of what was going on.
We retreated. The fire wasn't doing what you expected. You're standing there in the living room. What did you notice? Well, it's 14 years ago, but he said, I can still remember it was surprisingly hot. I thought the fire was in the back of the house, but I remember just feeling it's awfully, awfully hot here. And I said, okay, and what else did you notice? And he said, fires are noisy. When they're burning, they're noisy. And this was very quiet. And the reason it was hot and quiet is because the actual fire was right beneath them in the basement. That's what he didn't know. So I said, okay, so all of your experience was telling you, expect it shouldn't be this hot. And if it's this hot, it shouldn't be this quiet. And none of this was lining up. He could see for himself that it was his intuition based on his experience that had saved him.
The things that weren't right in that situation are what alerted him to potential danger, even though he didn't consciously notice them at the time. Now, what's striking when hearing these stories or thinking about my own experiences with intuition is the emotional aspect of it all. After all, we talk about gut feelings. And there's something about this emotional aspect that lends some sort of gravity and sometimes even an urgency to our intuitions. I spoke to Antonio Damasio, professor of neuroscience and philosophy at the University of Southern California. He knows a lot about the interplay between our emotions and rational decision-making, and in particular the important role emotions play in helping us make rational decisions.
I think that emotion is actually keying you into the preferred answer. In other words, if we were very flat and unemotive, we probably would not have intuition to any great extent. Because in general, and this is not necessary, but in general, intuitive responses are accompanied by either a positive or a negative emotion. We should not look at intuition as a purely intellectual process. It's a process that is governed by, of course, by intellect, because it relies on knowledge of facts to begin with, but it's very much driven by the emotions that are being evoked by the different choices and by what we feel as a result of those emotions.
Professor Damasio explained that we actually build up our intuition slowly, over time, by reflecting on our experiences and by listening to the emotions related to these experiences. After a while, we can then just listen to how we feel in a situation and know how to act without having to consciously think about things. Okay, so at the start of this episode, we heard from David Swindle about the murder of a young woman in a Glasgow church in 2006. He says he just knew the killer had killed before, and it seems he's not the only detective who goes on his intuition.
My name's Dr. Michelle Wright. I'm an investigative psychology researcher, and I'm a chartered psychologist.
Michelle Wright told me about a study where she initially wanted to find out how detectives put different homicides into categories, and she ended up seeing just how much detectives use their intuition. In this study, she gave detectives 20 scenes. For each one, they were given a photo taken from the crime scene and some basic information about the victim and the crime. They then talked through what they were thinking when presented with this limited evidence. This setup aimed to replicate the information a detective is likely to have upon visiting a crime scene for the first time.
The big discovery, if you like, was what happened as soon as the detective was handed the 20 crime scenes, was that automatically they began to develop inferences. So they went beyond the basic crime scene information that was available. So other than the information depicted in the actual photograph of the scene, there was a description of the age of the victim, the sex of the victim, how they'd been killed and where they'd been killed. But detectives automatically began to develop these detailed profile-like narratives of the circumstances that they thought had occurred surrounding the homicide.
Now remember, the detectives weren't getting that much information at this stage, simply one photo of the crime scene and a few very basic details. But they seemed to see a lot more about what had gone on.
I think I was most struck where they were able to go into a very detailed profile of the circumstances that they thought had occurred. One was a particularly graphic scene, which was of an elderly victim that had been found at an outdoor location. And one of the detectives said that he thought this was likely to be a deposition site and went on to question, why would you move an elderly person? Because they may be my grandma or my mother, and I wouldn't want them laying in the house.
So in this case, do you mean that they thought the killing hadn't taken place in the location where the body was found?
Yes, and that was an example of how they were making this hypothesis and detailed inference beyond what was depicted within the actual photograph of the victim being located within a woodland scene. Scene 13 was a female victim, aged 19, discovered lying on the floor of her lounge. The lower half of her body was covered with a small sheet. When detectives saw this photograph, the majority of them actually drew attention to very specific detail, commenting on the possible Christmas decorations hanging by the window and some cards on a window ledge.
And Michelle, what were the novices or the student group saying about this scene?
So they'd be categorising this scene as a female killed within an indoor home location.
And the detectives were categorising it how exactly?
So the detectives were referring to this as being domestic related. He went on to say, it does not look like someone has come in and the victim has been chased around the premises. It appears to be a contained assault, and as a result, he will be looking at those known to her.
So her study showed that detectives were able to glean a lot about a situation from not very much. She believes that intuition can be crucial in this early stage of an investigation, the so-called golden hour.
Out of the number of inferences made, 67% were accurate across all the sample. And that's extremely interesting because during the golden hour of a homicide investigation, detectives would have the same basic information available as what was provided to them within the crime scene exercise. So decisions made within the golden hour, the initial stage of an investigation, have been shown to be crucial to the overall success of an investigation.
Michelle Wright told me a lot of detectives use their intuition, but either they aren't aware of it or they can be hesitant to talk about it, perhaps because of the word's slightly nebulous or new agey connotations.
Words such as intuition, gut feelings, hunches have tended to be viewed with a lot of scepticism. So there's this sort of mystical phenomenon around intuition. And I think what my study has been able to show is the importance of detectives' knowledge and experience in being able to develop hypotheses and generate detailed inferences, which is important during the initial stages of a homicide investigation.
Now, let's put this together with David Swindle's experience.
When I looked at Angelica Kluck and what he'd done, I thought, this person has done this before.
Detective Swindle was so convinced of this that he set up a secret operation on the side looking into Peter Tobin's life, sort of trying to piece together his movements with cases of other missing women to see if there were any overlaps. He called this Operation Anagram.
And then when I started to look at Peter Tobin himself and said, well, look back at his life, we found out that he'd travelled throughout the United Kingdom. And he had houses in various parts of the United Kingdom. We looked as far back as the 1960s. And he also used aliases, so he used different names. So he used about 36 different names. He had cars in the 60s when other people didn't have them. He changed his appearance and he travelled throughout the UK. So he was an itinerant type of person that had opportunity, and it started to build. The picture started to build up. It developed into a big operation called Operation Anagram. I called it Anagram, Operation Anagram at the start. And this was a United Kingdom-wide investigation involving all police forces. And what it was doing, very simple, very basic, it was looking at Peter Tobin's life. And it was looking where he was over the years. And it was trying to identify potential victims. After he was convicted of killing Angelica Kluck in the church, Operation Anagram went public. And as a result, there was excavations in Margate in Kent. My hunch and my intuition is that Peter Tobin has killed lots of other people, but we may never know who else is killed.
If you're under a lot of time pressure, you're going to have to rely on your intuition, because there's no time to do the kinds of analyses that you want.
That's Gary Klein again, highlighting one of intuition's strengths and a time when it's worth listening to it. My next guest would agree, and this time it's someone from the world of policy and politics. Lord David Willetts used to be the UK's Minister of Universities and Science. He now runs the think tank the Resolution Foundation. They look into how to improve life for people on lower incomes. From all that, he sounds like the sort of person who'd be into rational analysis, but being a politician is a bit more complicated. I visited him to find out more.
I think we all use intuition a lot. And certainly in politics and in government, you're often taking decisions with limited time and limited information. I often say, if you think of a medical comparison, politicians and ministers aren't hospital consultants that can organise another set of tests before they take a decision. We're GPs, we're general practitioners, and every 10 minutes a new problem presents itself, and you need rapidly to reach a view on it on the basis of what you recognise is imperfect information, but the world doesn't stop for you to reflect as long as you'd always like. So yeah, I think we all function on intuition.
Again, politicians are drawing on experience when they use their intuition, and perhaps rational thinking is a bit overrated in their field anyway.
When a politician or a minister acts on intuition, behind that there is probably decades of experience. There's decades of taking similar decisions. So patterns develop in your mind almost unthinkingly. And of course, you will, one hopes, have also had time to absorb up-to-date evidence about what's going on. And what we try to do at Resolution Foundation is distill that and put it in an accessible form so that politicians and policymakers can draw on it. But I am very aware that the evidence changes. And sometimes you can put a lot of weight on a particular piece of evidence, and you think you're being very high-minded and evidence-driven, and then the evidence changes.
And relying too much on evidence and data collection and studies may be a bit against what it means to be a politician in the first place. I don't know about you, but when I think of a good politician, I think of someone with vision who stands for something, rather than a nerdy number cruncher.
When you stand on a manifesto, you don't stand on a manifesto which says, I'll keep up to date with the latest academic evidence and adjust my policies accordingly. You get elected on a manifesto which gives some sense of your governing philosophy, whether you think that public spending is by and large too high or too low, whether you're a believer in higher taxes or lower taxes. They want those principles, that sense of the character of a government, to be maintained. And that is quite important for accountability, that you set out a kind of governing philosophy and stick to it.